Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of our ongoing Coffee Talk series. Each of these Coffee Talk episodes is organized by the editors of RedmondMag.com and features the observations and insights of an independent expert on a wide range of tech industry topics. So welcome. Many thanks to the sponsor of this episode, Veeam. Without their support, this series would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director of the Converge 360 group here, and I'll be moderating today's episode. Today's topic, as you know, is top 10 disaster recovery risks in Microsoft 365, and our main presenter, is Brian Posey. Hey, Brian, thanks for joining us again.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. Before we get started, just a quick bit of housekeeping. This episode is being recorded for later access, so you'll get an email from us with a link to that recording. It should be in your inboxes in the next couple of days. Second, we are going to make time during this talk for questions. So as Brian is presenting, please do type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we're going to get to as many of them as possible. Third, our sponsor Veeam has provided some excellent resources that you won't want to miss. They're available right now on your console, so do check those out, download them. And finally, as a small thank you to the first 200 attendees who stick with us to the end of this Coffee Talk, we are sending you a $5 gift certificate to Starbucks. So let's go ahead and meet our first speaker today. As I said, Brian Posey is a frequent speaker here at our Coffee Talks and Summits, as well as an author of a long-running column on RedmondMag.com called Posey's Tips and Tricks. Besides that, Brian is a 22-time Microsoft MVP. He's written numerous IT books, created numerous full-length video training courses, as well as thousands of blog posts, as I mentioned, on RedmondMag.com and elsewhere. Thanks so much for joining us today, Brian. Take it away.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, and hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. So today we're going to be talking all about top 10 disaster recovery risks for Microsoft 365. And spoiler alert, there's quite a bit more than 10 that I'm going to be covering here. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now, I don't feel like we can really start talking about problems with backup and recovery in Microsoft 365 without first addressing Microsoft 365's shared responsibility model. Now, the shared responsibility model, for anybody who's not familiar with it, is essentially terms of service for the Microsoft 365 cloud. And while every cloud provider has their own nuances, this is something that's super common among most, if not all, cloud providers. It essentially defines the responsibilities for the cloud provider and the responsibilities for the customer. So in the case of Microsoft 365, what it basically boils down to is that Microsoft is responsible for securing and maintaining the backend infrastructure. These are the Microsoft 365 applications and the server hardware that those applications run on. So what that means is that you'll never be called upon to install a patch for Exchange Server or go to the Microsoft data center and replace a failed hard drive or anything like that. You don't have to worry about those things because under the shared responsibility model, that's Microsoft's responsibility. Now, the flip side to that is that customers are responsible for securing and maintaining their own data. So just as you'll never be called upon to install a security patch for one of the Microsoft 365 applications running in the Microsoft data center, Microsoft has things that they'll never be called upon to do either. And one of those things is restoring your data. I've heard rumors that Microsoft actually does back up customer data, but they do it for their own purposes rather than doing it for the benefit of the customer. The customer is responsible for backing up their own data. So why do you need a Microsoft 365 backup solution? Well, I got this little chart from Veeam, and it outlines 4 reasons. The first one is limited access and control of your own data. Now, I won't pretend to know what the person who created this chart was thinking, but the way that I interpret that first one is that if you were to suffer a data loss event, then obviously you lose access to that data. And the control standpoint is that by having a backup, that gives you options. Your data becomes portable at that point, and you can exfiltrate that data and move it to another location should it ever become necessary to do so. The second thing on this chart, retention policy gaps and data loss dangers. The basic idea behind this one is that Microsoft has certain protective mechanisms that are built into Microsoft 365. So that way, if one of your users were to accidentally delete a file or in some cases overwrite a file, you have a way of getting that back, even without a backup. So before I move on to the other 2 points on this slide, I want to delve into that just a little bit and talk about some of the native data recovery options that exist. and why these aren't necessarily going to be adequate. So what you see on the slide is some of the more commonly used recovery mechanisms that exist natively within the Microsoft 365 cloud. And I'll just mention that this is not an all-inclusive list. There are some others. The first thing we have is the SharePoint recycle bin. Just like the Windows recycle bin, if you accidentally delete something, that's usually where it goes, is the SharePoint recycle bin. And deleted items remain in there typically for 93 days. But beyond that 93 days, if you were to discover that something got deleted and you need to recover it and the 93-day retention period has expired, there's another 2 weeks during which Microsoft can recover that for you. All you have to do is make a phone call to Microsoft support. Now, the catch is that they can't recover just that item that was lost. They restore the entire site collection. So think about what a drastic option that truly is, because presumably it's been more than 93 days at that point since the item was deleted. So we're talking more than 3 months. So this would mean restoring an entire site collection to a point that it existed in more than 3 months ago. So truly, this is something that you would never, ever, ever want to do unless you just had absolutely no other option. So that's kind of a absolute last resort. Another mechanism that's available to you is the OneDrive recycle bin. Like the SharePoint recycle bin, if you're using a Microsoft 365 account, it stores deleted items for 93 days. If you're just using a standard Microsoft account and using the copy of OneDrive that comes with Windows, then you get 30 days instead of 93 days. Another mechanism is the Azure Active Directory recycle bin, and that stores deleted Azure AD objects for 30 days. And so if at any time during that 30 days you need to recover a deleted object, you can do so. And then there are a couple of other mechanisms that were never really designed for backup purposes, but they're sometimes used that way. One is something called litigation hold. The idea behind litigation hold is that if an organization is subject to litigation, then there may be a subpoena to preserve certain records. And so you can put that data under litigation hold, meaning that it will be retained in spite of any data lifecycle management policies that may exist. Those items aren't going to be deleted. They'll be preserved indefinitely in that litigation hold in an unchanged state until you choose to release it. So some people have thought, okay, litigation hold, that's a perfect option for backing up data that I never want to lose. And it can indeed be used for that purpose, but there are a couple of catches. One is that anything that you put in litigation hold counts against your Microsoft 365 storage limits. So you have a certain amount of storage that comes with your Microsoft 365 account. And if you exceed that, then you can always purchase additional storage, but it's not always going to be cheap. So whatever you place in litigation hold does count against those storage limits. And it can also be a little bit messy to restore things from litigation hold, particularly if you've got a lot of data to restore. Another mechanism is something called retention policies or versioning. Essentially what this means is that you can retain multiple versions of a file so that if a file is updated, you have a way of going back to a previous state of that file. Again, this counts against your storage limitations, and you can use up your space pretty quickly if you're doing versioning for rapidly changing files. And it can also be messy to restore version files since the files have to be exported and then manually brought back in. So those are some of the native recovery options that exist outside of a normal backup. So why not just use those? Well, there are a few different reasons rather. And this is by no means an all-inclusive list. I could probably do an entire session just on this slide alone. But the first reason is that recovery can sometimes be complex. Now, why does that matter? Well, if you think about it, anytime you're in a data loss situation, there's usually a lot of pressure to complete the recovery accurately and quickly. And if you've got something that's overly complex, that's going to interfere with both of those objectives because it may take you time to work through the recovery process because you're doing a lot of trial and error simply because it is so complex, or because it's super tedious and it requires a lot of manual operations. And if it's overly complex, there's also the potential for human error. So I recommend against using the native mechanisms as your primary data recovery option, simply because it does have a lot of potential for human error and it can take quite a while to do a full recovery. Another reason not to rely solely on the protective mechanisms is that your recovery options might not be quite as granular as you need. This is something I'm going to get into a little bit later on in the presentation, but essentially what this means is that you might not be able to recover exactly what it is that you want. If you're looking for a specific email, for example, maybe you'd be forced to recover an entire mailbox. That's just an example that's not necessarily the way that it holds true in Microsoft 365 with the native recovery mechanisms, because you can indeed recover an individual email from the deleted items folder. I just kind of threw that out there as an example of what granularity means. Third reason on the slide is that the built-in options can leave gaps in protection. So as you saw on the previous slide, there were native recovery mechanisms that were related to SharePoint, OneDrive, things like that. But not every Microsoft 365 application is listed. So you don't have comprehensive protection for all applications. Not to mention that there's no option with the native recovery mechanisms to recover absolutely everything across the entire Microsoft 365 cloud. That option doesn't exist. And then the last point on the slide is that there are some security threats that you might not be protected against. So let's just take a really common example of that. Let's suppose for a moment that you've got somebody in your IT department that is upset at management and completely disgruntled and wants to inflict the most damage possible before they walk out the door. Well, they could go in and delete a lot of data from your Microsoft 365 cloud. But if they work in IT, they probably know about these native recovery mechanisms. So they might take the extra step of going in and emptying out the various recycle bins, the SharePoint recycle bin, the OneDrive recycle bin, and that sort of thing. So at that point, if you're relying solely on those native protective mechanisms, you've got no recourse at all because the recycle bins have been emptied along with the primary copy of the data simply because of a security threat. So having said all of that, my advice with regard to the native recovery mechanisms is use them. They're fine. That's what they're there for. But treat it as a convenience feature, not as your primary data protection strategy. Use the native protective mechanisms when it makes sense to do so, when it's faster to go get something out of the recycle bin than to restore a backup. But don't rely on it as your sole source of protecting your data or as a backup replacement. So let's get back to this chart with what you're risking without a backup. The third thing on the list is security vulnerabilities. We've all seen examples of this where ransomware goes in and it encrypts all of the data, and so you suffer data loss as a result of a security threat. That unless you have a backup, at that point you're forced to pay the ransom, and even that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to be able to get all of your data back. And then the last point is regulatory exposure. Not every organization is subject to regulatory compliance, but those that are almost always required to have backups. And beyond that, there's often very specific language within the regulations that mandate what the requirements are for that backup. In other words, what does that backup need to be able to achieve in order to satisfy the regulations? So those are the risks of not having a Microsoft 365 backup solution. So let's say that you look at all of these risks, you put a backup into place, that's great. But just having a backup and backing up all of your data is really just a starting point, because there are some additional risks that can come into play with regard to your backups. And that's what the remainder of this presentation is all about. 10, or actually a little bit more than 10, risks that come into play when backing up or restoring your data. So let's get into it. The very first one on the list is recovery point objective. Now, I have to admit, I kind of hesitated to even put this in there because recovery point objective, or RPO, and recovery time objective, RPO, which I'll cover in a few minutes, are two things that almost everybody knows about. Nearly any introductory level discussion about backups focuses first and foremost on RTO and RPO because that's what backup strategies are generally based upon. Even so, there's a good reason why I put this in here, and that's because there are some potential pitfalls related to the recovery point objective. So for anybody who's not familiar with this term, recovery point objective simply states how frequently are we creating recovery points, a recovery point being a point in time that you can roll the system back to get your data back. So as a general rule, the more frequently you create recovery points, the less data could potentially be lost in a recovery situation. So it's usually in your best interest to create recovery points very frequently, or as much so as your particular individual situation will allow. Now, having said that, there is one caveat to that, and that is that creating extremely frequent recovery points can increase your backup storage costs. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, one thing to think about with regard to recovery points is you're going to have to make a decision as to how long to retain those recovery points. And there are a lot of different schools of thought on this one. One of the more popular schools of thought simply states that you don't want to retain a recovery point for any longer than that backup would be useful to you. So in other words, if there is no chance that you're going to be restoring a backup from 6 weeks ago because it's so outdated, then under that school of thought, there's no reason to hang on to a recovery point for that long. It's better to just go ahead and purge those old recovery points and move in anything that's applicable to that recovery point over to an archive instead, because it's going to be cheaper to store. But having said that, another thing to think about with regard to recovery point retention is that you don't always notice a problem right away. So let's suppose that you have a file that doesn't get accessed very often, but it's something that's really important to you. And you happen to notice that it was corrupted. You go back in time, say 6 weeks, and even that copy was corrupted. Do you have another option for getting that file back? In a situation like that, it may be useful in some situations to keep older recovery points on hand, just so that if you do notice longstanding corruption, maybe there's a chance that you can jump into a really old backup and get a copy of that file back. It really depends on the value of your data, the chances of corruption, and what's really going to be involved in storing those long-term recovery points. So just something to think about. Now, with regard to recovery points, there's one other problem that can come into play, particularly with regard to ransomware infections, because sometimes you can end up losing data as a result of restoring a recovery point, even if that data has been backed up. It's a little bit odd to think about, but it stems from the fact that ransomware infections don't do all of their damage instantaneously. So imagine, for example, that ransomware were to hit a file server in your organization. All of the files on that file server aren't going to become instantly encrypted the second that ransomware hits. It's going to take a little while for that ransomware to do its thing. And that's the basic philosophy behind what I'm about to show you. So let's suppose for a moment that at 10 a.m. a recovery point gets created. Then at 10:05 a.m. a ransomware attack begins. No problem. A recovery point was created 5 minutes before that, so everything's protected, right? Well, remember, ransomware attacks don't do all of their data or all of their damage instantaneously. So let's say that as of 10:10 a.m., the effects aren't being widely felt just yet. Users are still working for the most part, and you have a user who makes an update to a critical file. Now, let's suppose that at 10:15 a.m., another recovery point gets created. So at that point, that recovery point contains that update to that critical file, but it also contains some of the files that have become encrypted as a result of that ransomware infection, because the infection is in progress. Not everything's been encrypted yet, but some things have been. So then, let's say that at 10:20, the user's critical file that they just updated gets encrypted by that ongoing ransomware infection. At 10:30, IT discovers that the ransomware attack began at 10:05, and so they say, okay, no problem, let's go back and restore that 10 a.m. recovery point. Well, by doing that, they undo all of the damage from the ransomware infection, but they also lose that critical update that user made. And the ironic thing about that is the critical update has been saved, or has been backed up, rather. It was backed up in the 10:15 a.m. recovery point. But because the administrator chose to restore that 10 a.m. recovery point, those changes that the user made are lost. So that's just kind of one of the pitfalls that sometimes comes into play with regard to restoring recovery points following a ransomware attack. So pitfall number 2 stems from the recovery time objective. The recovery time objective essentially translates to how long is it going to take you to get your data back? How long will it take to perform a restoration? Now, the RTO, as a matter of policy, can be something of a double-edged sword. It can either benefit you or it can work against you. Back when I had a real job, I'll never forget this. I had a situation in which a data loss event had occurred, and we were trying to restore that data from backup. And one of the higher-ups kept coming into the room every few minutes, screaming, swearing, making all kinds of threats, simply because we weren't restoring fast enough. You know, the tape drive was doing its thing, but it wasn't to this guy's liking. He wanted it to run faster than it was physically capable of doing. So that's where RPO comes into play. RPO didn't exist at that time, but if it did, had we had one in place, we could have said something like, look, the stated RPO that's in the operational handbook says that we have 30 minutes to recover this. It's only been 15 minutes. We'll let you know when it's back up. On the other hand, if we were 35 minutes in and the policy said that we had 30, well, that's the sort of thing that IT pros can lose their jobs over. So that's what I mean when I say an RPO can, or an RTO rather, can be a double-edged sword. It can work for you or it can work against you. So just something to keep in mind. Now, with regard to the recovery time objective, you have to consider where your data is saved because that can really impact the amount of time that it takes to perform a restoration. And this leads to a recent announcement that Microsoft made. Microsoft recently announced a product called Microsoft Backup that's going to be integrated into Microsoft 365. So this is going to be a brand new option that's going to appear in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center that will allow you to back up all of your Microsoft 365 data from within the console. So there are a few things that you need to think about with regard to this new tool. And incidentally, it's not in Microsoft 365 yet. The announcement was made maybe a few weeks ago, so it's not in production yet. It's still being in preview mode. So a few things to think about. First of all, Microsoft Backup was never designed to be a comprehensive backup solution. It will work in a pinch, but it's extremely lightweight. It's simple to use, but it doesn't back up all of the Microsoft 365 data. Teams is conspicuously absent from the backups. Hopefully this is something that Microsoft will add in later on, but it's not there yet. But having said that, it's better than no backup at all. My guess is that Microsoft Backup is primarily going to appeal to organizations that aren't backing up their Microsoft 365 data at all. And then one day they log into the console, see the option, and oh, here's a backup option. Maybe we should be backing up our data. But it does offer a few benefits. The main reason why I chose to mention Microsoft Backup here is because one of the benefits is that you can back up your data to the Microsoft Data Center, which means faster restorations than if you were restoring from an on-premises data repository or from a competing cloud or something like that. Now, the risk there is that if something were to happen to the Microsoft Data Center, then you could lose your primary data and your backup data. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. I'm not saying don't use Microsoft Backup, but it may be a good idea to replicate that backup to another cloud or to another location, just as a way of having multiple copies of your backup. One of the really interesting things about Microsoft Backup, though, is that Microsoft is making the API available to third-party backup vendors. What that means is that third-party backup providers will be able to leverage that API and make it so that their products will be able to take advantage of the additional throughput provided by Microsoft Backup. So if you've got a backup product you're already using, chances are in the next version or two, support will be included for Microsoft Backup, and you'll be able to take advantage of those speed benefits without having to change the way that you do things. So just some things to think about. So pitfall number 3, premature recovery. This is one of those things that kind of goes back to what I was talking about recovery points. But I wanted to go ahead and mention this anyway, just because it's something that I've seen in the real world. And this is a situation in which a data loss event occurs, and an often inexperienced backup admin sees the situation, panics, and launches a restore before fully assessing the situation. And sometimes that restore process can do more damage than simply working the problem, because you have the potential of overwriting newer data with older data that's stored in the backup. Pitfall number 4, the chain of command. This really comes down to who it is that's responsible for performing the backup and other backup-related tasks. So one of the big questions is, in your organization, who's responsible for backups? And as a follow-up question, do they know it? That follow-up question sounds absolutely absurd, I admit. And yet this is something that I've seen in the real world. I once saw a situation in which an organization tasked a particular user with creating and managing the organization's backups. But with all of the corporate bureaucracy that was in place, somehow or other, that user was never even told about that responsibility. So management assumed that backups were being made, and the IT department was none the wiser that this particular person was supposed to be doing it because they were never told. So even if you know who's making your backups, something to think about is what happens if the backup operator is on vacation. Because suppose a restoration needs to be performed, and the person who normally does that is out of the office. You can't automatically assume that you're going to be able to reach that person by phone or by email and have them do the operation remotely. In a perfect world, yes, that's exactly how it would go down. But even in today's world, it's not always possible to reach people. There was a time when I used to intentionally plan my vacations based not so much on an activity that I wanted to get into or anything like that, as much as making myself inaccessible just so the place that I worked couldn't find me while I'm on vacation. I'm talking about things like hiking in the rainforest or even a trip to Antarctica. I actually did those things kind of as a way of hiding from my job while I was on vacation. So the point being that there are places, even in today's world, where an employee might be able to go and be inaccessible by phone or email. So in a situation like that, you've got to have a contingency plan. Another thing to think about is, how do you know that your backups are good? Presumably, this comes down to backup testing, but how often are you testing your backups? And what procedure are you using for backup testing that gives you the confidence of knowing for sure that your backups are good? And one point that I want to make sure and clarify here is that backup testing is different from backup validation. I once saw something, and I honestly cannot remember if this was a demo at a conference that I saw or if this was real world, but I saw a situation in which an organization performed a backup and then restored that backup, and the restoration was no good even though it validated perfectly. So here's how that happened. The organization had a Windows server, and there was one critical system file that was missing from that Windows server, but that file was used only during the boot process. So because the server was already up and running, it was fine. There was no reason to know that there was a problem with that server. So backups were being made. Those backups validated because the backup matched what was on the server. But both the backup and the server were missing that critical system file. So at some point, that server was rebooted, and it failed to boot because of the missing file. And so the backup was restored, and the server was still unable to boot because the backup didn't contain a copy of that file either. So that's what I mean when I say that backup testing is different than backup verification. So you have to think about what procedure your organization is using to truly verify that your backups are good and that they contain what you think that they contain. One more thing to think about on this point is, does your recovery testing cause any compliance problems? And what I mean by this is that in some organizations, there may be operational procedures or compliance mandates that essentially state that IT is not allowed to look at certain types of data. Well, if you're performing recovery testing, it's really hard to know if data restored correctly if you're not even allowed to look at that data. So this is something that you may need to plan for and may even need to bring in other people who are allowed to see the data that you're testing the recovery of. So another potential pitfall is permissions that get lost during a restoration. Now, any reputable Microsoft 365 backup product should be able to retain the permissions of the data that it's backing up. That's a very standard and typical thing. The only reason why I included this particular point is because I saw one particular situation way back when in which an organization backed up and they restored that backup and lost all of the permissions in the process. Thankfully, when that happened, it didn't give blanket permissions to everything, to everybody. It kind of did the opposite. It locked everybody out of all of the data that had been recovered. And in that situation, all of those permissions and group memberships and things like that had to be manually reestablished. And that involved a lot of phone calls to department heads, and it was a team effort. It took an entire day to restore all of the missing permissions. And even then, it wasn't necessarily perfect. So just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. So pitfall number 6, backup and recovery procedures. The essence of this one is, are your backup procedures documented? And if so, are they well documented? Now, I'll be the first to admit that I'm not necessarily a huge fan of documentation in every situation. I've seen way too many examples of procedures that get documented and then never looked at again. But when it comes to backup and recovery, I'm a big believer in documenting recovery procedures step by step. And there are a few different reasons for that. The big one is that recovery operations are high-stress, high-stakes operations. And if you've got a checklist that walks you through it step by step, then that minimizes the impact, or minimizes the chances rather, of human error occurring during the recovery process. Also, if you end up in a situation like what I talked about earlier, where the primary backup operator is out on vacation, then a well-documented set of procedures should allow somebody else to go in and perform the recovery in that person's absence. So it's really important to have well-documented recovery procedures and to periodically review those procedures and revise them as necessary based on software updates that may have changed the user interface or based on lessons that have been learned during previous recovery operations. So point number 7, data egress fees. Data egress fees, for anybody who isn't familiar with them, are punitive fees that are charged by many cloud storage providers as a way of discouraging their customers from moving data out of their clouds. So remember, when you store data in the cloud, you're paying for that data on a per gigabyte per month basis. And because the cloud provider is making money on that, they don't want you to move your data out of their cloud. So what they do is they put data egress fees in place. Essentially, they're saying, okay, it's your data. You can take it out of the cloud if you want. But if you do, we're going to penalize you by charging you this fee. The reason why I mention that is that when you restore a backup from another cloud, in most cases, that's going to trigger a data egress fee. And so it's really important to budget for that. You need to review what it's going to cost you based on the cloud provider's fee structure. And this is something that needs to be done from time to time because that fee structure can change. And your data will presumably grow over time. So the amount that you're going to incur in data egress fees is going to increase just based on data growth, if nothing else. So it's important to periodically revisit that just so that you have an idea of what a large-scale recovery operation could potentially end up costing you. Pitfall number 8, lack of granularity. And I touched on this one earlier. The essence of this idea is that when data recovery becomes necessary, you want to recover exactly what's needed and nothing more. And there are a few different reasons why you don't want to recover anything that you don't have to. One, if something was deleted intentionally and it needs to be gone, then restoring more data than needs to be restored has the potential to bring that deleted data back. Another problem is that if you do a bulk data restoration, you open up the potential for that that recovery operation rather to take longer than it would if you were only recovering the data that needed to be restored. And then another reason is that if you restore more data than is actually needed, you run the risk of overwriting data that's been updated since the time that that backup was created. So this is where granularity comes into play. It's essentially the idea that you need to be able to restore data in pretty much any way imaginable. In the case of Exchange, for example, maybe you need to restore an entire information store. Maybe you need to restore an individual mailbox, maybe just a message within that mailbox or a calendar item or something like that. With regard to SharePoint, maybe you need to recover a site or a file. Maybe you need to recover an individual object from the Azure Active Directory or an application as a whole. The point is you should be able to recover in the way that makes sense based on your situation. Pitfall number 9, backup misconfiguration. And this really goes back to backup testing, but I wanted to include this because I've seen way too many real-world situations in which an organization thought they were doing everything right, and then when a recovery eventually did become necessary, they found out that either they weren't backing up the data that they thought they were, or they realized there was a configuration problem and it prevented the data from being restored. So make sure that you're doing that backup testing and that you can verify that everything is configured correctly. And as a side note, it's really important that if you're encrypting your backups, you're doing something to protect those encryption keys, because if you lose the encryption keys, you're not going to be able to restore that backup. So it's important to have more than one copy of the encryption key and to keep those copies in a safe place so that you can get to them should your primary copy of the encryption keys be destroyed. And then point number 10, application breakage. And this is one of those things that I never ever hear anybody talk about, but it's important nonetheless. The idea here is that Microsoft 365 kind of breaks the traditional model of data and data types, or excuse me, applications and data types. Traditionally, every application has a specific type of data associated with it. Think about desktop applications. Word creates Word documents. Acrobat creates PDF files. If we're talking about servers, SQL Server has a SQL Server database associated with it. Well, Microsoft 365 works a little bit differently. We have some of the older applications, such as Exchange, that do store data in a data type that's specifically tied to that application. Exchange mailboxes are stored in an Exchange information store. But not every Microsoft 365 application is like that. Teams, for example, scatters data all over the place. Some of the Teams data is stored in Exchange, some is stored in SharePoint, and there are a variety of other locations throughout the Microsoft 365 cloud where Teams data gets stored. Here's a breakdown of some of those locations. So the reason why I mention this is because when it comes to backing up and restoring your data in Microsoft 365, you can end up in situations where you can actually break one application by deleting or incorrectly restoring data associated with an unrelated application. So suppose for a moment that you perform a recovery on a SharePoint site. Well, Teams stores some of its data in SharePoint, and if the site that you've recovered happens to be tied to Teams, and you restore an older version of that site, but not the same version of some of the other Teams data types, you can end up in a situation where data within Teams becomes very inconsistent, and you can cause who knows what kind of random problem. So that's just something to think about with regard to application consistency in Microsoft 365. Now, I mentioned that I had one more point for you beyond just the top 10, and I'll go through this quickly because I'm already over on my time. But what's your plan for dealing with a failed restoration? Because let's suppose for a moment that you've done everything right, you've done all the backup testing, you've backed up the data that needs to be backed up, and then one day you have a data loss event. So you restore your backup and the restoration operation fails. What do you do at that point? Well, presumably you would try it again. But let's say that second attempt also fails. What's your next step beyond that? Well, hopefully you have other copies of your data stored elsewhere, or you have a backup stored on immutable storage or an air-gapped backup or something like that. Every organization would handle this differently, but the point being that your primary backup shouldn't be your only source of, or shouldn't be your only means of being able to recover your data. It's always important to have some type of fallback plan. So with that said, I am out of time, but I want to go ahead and try to squeeze in a few questions.
I think we have time for one question, Brian. This one's from Greg. Will Microsoft's new backup solution be able to back up non-Microsoft 365 data? Greg.
No, it won't. It's only going to be geared for Microsoft 365 data, so you're not going to be able to back up other cloud applications or applications in your data center or anything like that. But having said that, remember what I said about Microsoft making that API available to third-party backup vendors. If you've got a backup vendor that you're currently using and it allows you to back up those third-party data locations, but it leverages Microsoft 365 backup on the back end, then you'll be able to use an application like that to back up that external data.
Okay. We have one more question. We're going to try to do this one. This is from MJ. If my organization does not have a formal RTO in place, should I begin the process of creating one?
That's really up to you. Like I pointed out during the presentation, it's kind of a double-edged sword. There are advantages and disadvantages. Me personally, I would prefer to err on the side of not having one if you don't already have one, because you don't want to tie your own hands and force yourself to perform recovery operations within a certain amount of time if you're not already required to do so.
Excellent.